It wasn't fought with bullets or bombs, but with banks, oil, and backroom deals. For decades, two families quietly battled for control of America's future, and most people never realized they were living through an economic Cold War. On one side stood J.P. Morgan, the iron-handed banker who believed he could shape the nation through finance. On the other, John D. Rockefeller, the oil king who thought he could fuel his own empire into eternity. Their weapons weren't soldiers. They were stocks, mergers, and political favors. Every headline on Wall Street, every law passed in Washington, even the shape of modern capitalism itself was touched by their hidden war. Behind the polite smiles of Gilded Age society, there was hatred. Each man believed he, and only he, should define how power worked in America. And when those visions collided, the result was a quiet but brutal conflict that reshaped the modern world. One boardroom meeting, one market crash, one whispered threat at a time. This is the untold story of the secret war between the Morgans and the Rockefellers, a war that decided who would truly rule America, the banker or the oil baron. But before we can understand how they fought, we need to understand why they were destined to clash in the first place.
To understand this silent war, you need to go back to the birth of American capitalism, a time when there were no real rules, only ambition. The late 1800s were a wild age. Railroads cut across the continent, cities exploded with factories, and fortunes appeared out of dust and coal. It was a playground for the bold and a graveyard for the careless. Out of that chaos, two men rose higher than everyone else, and they couldn't have been more different. John D. Rockefeller came from almost nothing. Born in 1839 to a traveling salesman father and a deeply religious mother, Rockefeller grew up with one lesson: money was to be earned, saved, and controlled. Even as a child, he kept meticulous ledgers of every penny he made. While others chased luck, he believed in systems, order, logic, patience. So when the oil rush hit Pennsylvania, Rockefeller saw not a gold mine, but a mess. Drillers were wasting oil, prices crashed weekly, and transportation was chaos. But Rockefeller wasn't after a quick fortune. He was after stability. He built refineries that ran like clockwork, eliminated waste, and negotiated secret rebates with railroads that gave him discounts his competitors could only dream of. Every deal was precise, quiet, and suffocatingly effective. Competitors called it ruthless. Rockefeller called it business. He would undercut rivals until they broke, then buy their refineries for pennies. By the time they realized what had happened, it was too late. Standard Oil controlled over 90% of the American refining market. Rockefeller didn't just dominate the industry, he designed it. The oil in your lamp, the kerosene in your stove, even the way you paid for it, all traced back to him. But in New York, another kind of empire was forming, one that didn't dig or drill, but pulled strings from above. John Pierpont Morgan, born into privilege, was the son of a powerful banker who had connections stretching from Wall Street to London. Where Rockefeller's empire rose from dirt and labor, Morgan's was built on mahogany desks and gold ink signatures. He was educated in the art of leverage, how to control assets without owning them, how to stabilize chaos without touching the dust. Morgan's talent wasn't in creating things, it was in organizing them. He believed the American economy was too wild, too unstable, and only someone like him could bring order to it. So he began a new kind of empire, one made of trusts, mergers, and reorganizations. When railroads collapsed under debt, Morgan swooped in, bought controlling shares, and restructured them. When industries fought ruinous price wars, he forced competitors to merge. He didn't just make money, he made rules, and he made sure those rules served him. By the late 1800s, Morgan's influence reached everywhere. He financed the government, stabilized panicked markets, and in the public's eyes, became the man who could single-handedly prevent an economic collapse. His crowning moment came in 1901, when he merged Andrew Carnegie's steel empire with several smaller firms to create U.S. Steel, the world's first billion-dollar corporation. It was more than a company. It was a message. No one builds power like Morgan. Rockefeller saw Morgan's success with quiet disgust. He believed in owning tangible things, land, refineries, pipelines, not paper promises and manipulative bankers. To Rockefeller, Morgan was the symbol of everything wrong with finance, men who profited without producing. Morgan, meanwhile, viewed Rockefeller as a crude monopolist, a self-righteous oil baron who believed money was morality and that control justified everything. To Morgan, Rockefeller wasn't a businessman, he was a zealot with ledgers. In reality, both were right and both were wrong. Their visions of capitalism were total opposites. Rockefeller wanted absolute ownership, build the empire, own every piece, and lock it down. Morgan wanted strategic control. You don't need to own everything if you can manipulate the flow of capital. One believed power came from industry, the other from credit. It was only a matter of time before those worlds collided. By the dawn of the 20th century, both men were no longer individuals. They were institutions. The Rockefeller network stretched across refineries, pipelines, and shipping routes that reached every coast. The Morgan network extended through banks, railroads, steel, and even the U.S. Treasury itself. To outsiders, they seemed untouchable, but behind the polished portraits in marble offices, a storm was brewing. Whispers circulated through Wall Street that the two titans had begun quietly undermining each other, lobbying against one another in Washington, blocking loans, influencing newspaper coverage, and funding rival industrialists just to keep each other in check. It wasn't open war, not yet, but it was coming. Because soon politics, public anger, and one explosive courtroom battle would drag their hidden rivalry into the light and force America to choose between its banker and its oil king.
For a time, the two empires pretended to coexist. After all, they needed each other. Rockefeller's oil empire ran on rails and ships that Morgan often financed. Morgan's railroads, in turn, needed the fuel and industrial stability that Rockefeller's refineries provided. They didn't like each other, but they understood each other. And for men obsessed with control, understanding was its own kind of weapon. There were dinners, meetings, and carefully worded letters. Both sides smiled, but neither side trusted the other for a second. In the polished offices of Wall Street, everyone knew when a Morgan banker met a Rockefeller man, there was always a game beneath the conversation. Each handshake was a test, every deal a trap waiting to spring. The first visible crack appeared in the late 1890s when the Morgans began tightening their grip on the railroad industry. To Morgan, the future of America lay in infrastructure and consolidation. Railroads, steel, shipping, and finance all connected under one disciplined hierarchy. He called it stability. Rockefeller called it control by parasites. At that time, Rockefeller's Standard Oil had secret rebate agreements with several railroad companies. The deals were brilliant and brutal. They allowed him to ship oil cheaper than anyone else, driving competitors into bankruptcy. But when Morgan-backed financiers took over some of those railroads, the tone shifted. Suddenly, the old favors weren't being honored. Shipping costs rose. New review committees started questioning the terms. It was a warning shot, and Rockefeller knew exactly who was behind it. Morgan, ever the tactician, wanted leverage. By pressuring the railroads, he could force Rockefeller to negotiate on his terms. But Rockefeller wasn't the kind of man who bowed to bankers. He retaliated in the only way he knew: build his own transportation network. By 1899, Standard Oil wasn't just refining and selling oil, it was buying ships, pipelines, and storage facilities outright, cutting the railroads out entirely. Rockefeller's message was clear: "I don't need you. I can build my own empire without your permission." Behind the scenes, whispers spread that Rockefeller was using his massive cash reserves to quietly buy up stock in Morgan-controlled companies, just to keep an eye on them, and sometimes to sabotage them from within. Morgan's men noticed. They began forming closed circles, new syndicates that quietly excluded Standard Oil interests. The rivalry was no longer economic cooperation. It was a chess match played in silence. Each man moved carefully, aware that one misstep could trigger financial chaos across the nation. But then came something neither could control: public anger. By the turn of the century, the American public had grown restless. People were beginning to see the cost of unchecked power. Journalists, known as muckrakers, began exposing the corruption and monopolies that had defined the Gilded Age. And in 1902, one article changed everything: Ida Tarbell's exposé on Standard Oil. Tarbell's reporting was relentless. She painted Rockefeller not as a genius industrialist, but as a calculating villain who crushed small businesses and manipulated the market. The public, already tired of corporate greed, turned on him overnight. Politicians smelled blood. Antitrust laws that had been ignored for years suddenly became weapons, and at the center of it all, J.P. Morgan watched quietly and smiled. To Morgan, the backlash was an opportunity. Rockefeller's empire was under siege, and public outrage was the perfect cover for Morgan's own maneuvering. When President Theodore Roosevelt began his trust-busting campaign, Morgan presented himself as the responsible capitalist, the man who could bring balance to a reckless economy. He visited the White House personally, arguing that his corporate reorganizations actually protected the economy from the chaos of men like Rockefeller. It was pure performance, but it worked. While Rockefeller faced investigations, Morgan's influence in Washington only grew stronger. Privately, Rockefeller saw through the act. He called Roosevelt Morgan's man in the White House, believing the entire antitrust movement was being manipulated by Morgan's circle to break Standard Oil's dominance. The irony was brutal. The same laws that once ignored monopolies were now being used to dismantle his life's work, while Morgan positioned himself as the savior of American capitalism. In 1911, the Supreme Court ordered the breakup of Standard Oil into 34 smaller companies. The decision was hailed as a victory for fairness and free markets. But in the quiet corners of Wall Street, the truth was more complicated. Morgan's banks profited enormously from reorganizing and financing the newly independent oil companies. The Rockefeller empire had been split apart, and Morgan had found a way to make money from the pieces. To the public, the robber barons had been tamed, but to those who understood power, this was only a new phase of the war. The battlefield had shifted from refineries and railroads to boardrooms and politics. The question was no longer who owned America's industries. It was who controlled America's money. And soon, both men would find themselves fighting over something far more dangerous than oil or steel: the very heart of American financial system.
After the fall of Standard Oil, the public thought Rockefeller was finished. They were wrong. If anything, he'd just become more dangerous, quieter, smarter, and richer than ever before. The breakup of Standard Oil created over 30 new companies, each technically independent, but Rockefeller owned massive shares in every single one. When their stock prices soared, so did his fortune. The newspapers declared his empire destroyed, but behind the curtain, Rockefeller became the richest man in the world, wealthier than entire nations. And now, he was thinking bigger than oil. Meanwhile, J.P. Morgan's name had become synonymous with power. He had financed America's railroads, steel, and even electricity.
When the U.S. economy trembled during the Panic of 1907, it wasn't the government that saved Wall Street. It was Morgan. He locked the nation's most powerful bankers inside his library and refused to let them leave until they agreed to a rescue plan. By dawn, the markets were stable again. The newspapers hailed him as a hero, the man who saved America. But to men like Rockefeller, it was proof of something terrifying. Morgan wasn't just a banker anymore. He had become the de facto ruler of the U.S. financial system. That night changed everything. Washington realized how fragile the economy really was and how much power was concentrated in one man's hands. Within a few years, this realization would lead to the creation of the Federal Reserve System in 1913, an institution meant to prevent another crisis and to keep private bankers like Morgan from single-handedly controlling the nation's credit. But here's the twist most history books forget. The very people involved in shaping the Federal Reserve, many came from Morgan's and Rockefeller's inner circles. Bankers, senators, and industrialists met in secret at Jekyll Island, a private club off the coast of Georgia, to design the new system. Officially, it was meant to protect the public. Unofficially, it was about protecting their empires. When the dust settled, both dynasties had found ways to embed themselves in the structure of the new Federal Reserve. Morgan's allies dominated the eastern banking districts. Rockefeller's allies held influence through National Citibank, which evolved into Citibank, a financial powerhouse that would carry Rockefeller money well into the 20th century. The result wasn't peace. It was a Cold War of capital. Each side controlled key financial arteries of the American economy. Every loan, every merger, every government bond issue. Somewhere behind it, you could trace the fingerprints of a Morgan partner or a Rockefeller trust. Their rivalry wasn't personal anymore, it was institutional. And it was about to go global. When World War I erupted in 1914, the conflict overseas turned into a financial feeding frenzy in New York. Europe needed weapons, ships, and supplies, and it needed credit to pay for them. J.P. Morgan & Company became the official purchasing agent for the British and French governments, funneling billions into the Allied war effort. Morgan's syndicate made enormous profits, and his influence in Washington soared. His critics said he was using war to become the world's banker. They weren't entirely wrong. But the Rockefellers weren't sitting still. Their oil flowed through engines, ships, and armies on both sides of the Atlantic. Kerosene, gasoline, lubricants, Standard Oil descendants provided the literal fuel of war. As Morgan's banks financed the conflict, Rockefeller's oil kept it running. It was the ultimate irony. The banker and the oil baron, enemies at home, quietly profiting from the same global inferno. Behind the scenes, the families maneuvered for dominance in the new international order. Morgan's network pushed for tighter cooperation between American and European banks. Rockefeller's network built oil concessions in Latin America and the Middle East, trying to secure energy control before the next crisis came. And yet, beneath all the deals and diplomacy, the tension remained personal. The Morgans saw themselves as guardians of the old world, educated, aristocratic, believing capitalism should be controlled from the top. The Rockefellers saw themselves as architects of a new world, modern, efficient, driven by corporate management and mass production. It wasn't just a financial battle, it was cultural, philosophical, almost spiritual. By the 2020s, both dynasties had grown too vast to fight directly. Their empires had merged with the American system itself. Morgan banks underwrote industrial bonds, Rockefeller foundations funded universities, research, and medicine. Their names were everywhere, on skyscrapers, hospitals, and art museums. To the public, it seemed like peace at last. But inside the quiet halls of finance, there were whispers that the balance was shifting again. Morgan's financial empire was overextended, trapped in risky loans and post-war speculation. Rockefeller's oil empire, meanwhile, had reinvented itself as a global energy network, diversified, liquid, and quietly untouchable. And when the crash came in 1929, it would expose which dynasty had built its foundation on sand. Because the Great Depression didn't just destroy banks and businesses, it rewrote the hierarchy of American power. And when the dust cleared, one name would still stand, richer and stronger than ever. It wasn't Morgan's.
By the roaring 1920s, America seemed unstoppable. Jazz filled the air, stock prices soared, and Wall Street became a temple of greed and optimism. And at the center of it all was the House of Morgan, the empire that had financed America's greatest industries and claimed to be the guardian of economic order. But beneath the champagne and ticker tape, the system was rotting. Speculation had replaced strategy. Brokers sold dreams instead of shares, and the Morgan banks, confident in their reputation, poured money into the bubble, certain that, as always, they could manage the risk. They couldn't. When the stock market crashed in 1929, panic tore through the financial world like a firestorm. Banks collapsed by the thousands, factories closed, millions lost their jobs, and the public, desperate for someone to blame, turned its fury on the same men who had once been hailed as heroes. This time, J.P. Morgan's name wasn't a symbol of stability, it was a curse. The timing couldn't have been worse for the Morgan dynasty. J.P. Morgan himself had died in 1913, just before the world he built began to unravel. His successors, Jack Morgan and Thomas Lamont, lacked his iron command. They still held immense influence, but not the authority to tame chaos. For the first time in half a century, the House of Morgan looked vulnerable. And John D. Rockefeller, now in his 90s, was watching from the sidelines, amused. He had spent years being vilified by the press, painted as a symbol of greed and corruption. Now the same papers that once crucified him were tearing the Morgans apart. To him, it must have felt like poetic justice, the world turning on his oldest enemy. But Rockefeller didn't celebrate out loud. He didn't have to. His empire had already transformed. The old Standard Oil network, now broken into independent companies like Exxon, Mobil, and Chevron, had spread globally, feeding the new industrial age. While Morgan's banks drowned in bad loans and failing industries, Rockefeller's companies pumped oil into every engine, every ship, every generator that kept the modern world alive. Oil had become the bloodstream of civilization, and Rockefeller owned the veins. Still, the Morgans weren't finished. Not yet. During the early years of the Great Depression, they fought desperately to preserve their influence. They organized relief loans, met with presidents, and even financed international bailouts. But the political winds had shifted. The age of unregulated power was over. The government, once their obedient partner, had turned against them. In 1932, Franklin D. Roosevelt swept into office, promising reform. And when Congress began investigating Wall Street's collapse, the Pujo Committee and later the Pecora hearings dragged the private dealings of America's biggest banks into the spotlight. For the first time, the public saw how the Morgans had secretly controlled dozens of companies through interlocking directorates, how a small circle of bankers effectively ran the economy. The myth of benevolent Morgan stewardship shattered overnight. But here's where the story takes a darker twist. As the government moved to regulate banking, the Rockefellers quietly adapted. They saw what was coming, and they were already one step ahead. Rockefeller interests shifted their focus from heavy industry to finance and energy. While Morgan's empire fractured under the Glass-Steagall Act, which forced banks to separate commercial and investment operations, Rockefeller money began flowing through Chase National Bank, soon to become Chase Manhattan. Under the leadership of Rockefeller protégés, it grew into a global powerhouse, eventually merging with the remnants of Morgan's own network decades later. It was the ultimate irony. While the Morgans were being dismantled in congressional hearings, the Rockefellers were laying the foundations of the next generation of banking dominance. The rules had changed, and this time they were the ones writing them. Meanwhile, America itself was being reshaped by Roosevelt's New Deal. The state was now the referee of capitalism. To the public, this looked like the end of the old robber baron era, the triumph of regulation over greed. But to insiders, it was simply a transfer of power from one dynasty to another. The Rockefellers had mastered something the Morgans never could: adaptation. Where the Morgans tried to preserve the past, the Rockefellers embraced the future. They diversified into new industries: chemicals, aviation fuel, global energy logistics. They funded research that led to breakthroughs in medicine, education, and technology. And through their vast philanthropic network, the Rockefeller Foundation, the University of Chicago, and the Rockefeller Institute, they rewrote their family's image from ruthless monopolists to enlightened visionaries. By the time the World War II erupted, the transformation was complete. Morgan's empire was a relic of the old world, surviving mostly through its partnership with the government during wartime financing. But the Rockefellers, their oil fueled the tanks, planes, and battleships that fought across Europe and the Pacific. Their companies expanded into Latin America, the Middle East, and Asia, securing global access to oil reserves. For the first time in history, energy and money were united under one vision: the Rockefeller vision. When the war ended, America emerged as the world's new superpower. And behind that power, quietly, stood the Rockefeller network, the invisible hand guiding the global economy into the age of oil, automobiles, and corporate globalization. The Morgans had once ruled through finance, but the Rockefellers had found something far more enduring: control over the world's energy itself. Yet, even as one dynasty seemed to triumph, the game wasn't over. Because in the shadows of post-war America, new players were rising, and soon both families would find themselves entangled in a far bigger struggle: the war for the future of global power. By the mid-20th century, the world had changed forever. Empires had fallen, cities were in ruins, and two new superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, faced each other across a world split by fear. But behind the speeches, treaties, and atomic tests, another power was consolidating, one that didn't wear crowns or uniforms. It wore suits, it held board meetings, and it shaped the post-war world not through armies, but through influence. And no family understood this new game better than the Rockefellers. While Europe rebuilt from the ashes, David, Nelson, John III, and Lawrence Rockefeller, the second generation, stepped out of their father's shadow with a clear strategy. Don't just fund industry, shape policy. Don't just sell oil, control its flow. Don't just make money, define the world order. Nelson Rockefeller went into politics, climbing rapidly from assistant to Franklin Roosevelt to governor of New York, and nearly becoming U.S. president. David Rockefeller, the most calculated of them all, entered banking, transforming Chase Manhattan Bank into a global powerhouse, with branches in over 70 countries. But more importantly, David built a network, connecting Wall Street, Washington, and the world's capitals into one web of quiet influence. While the Morgans had once ruled through private deals and boardrooms, the Rockefellers created something far more sophisticated: the institutional empire. Instead of controlling one company, they built foundations, councils, and think tanks, that shaped how nations thought, planned, and spent. The Rockefeller Foundation, established decades earlier to clean the family's image, now became a force in global development. It funded universities, research labs, and international relief programs. Its grants reached into the World Health Organization, the United Nations, and the World Bank, all born from a vision the Rockefellers helped finance. In 1945, as the UN looked for a home, the family donated land in New York City. On that ground rose the UN headquarters, a literal monument to Rockefeller influence on global governance. While the world saw generosity, insiders saw something deeper: a seat at the table of world power. Meanwhile, the Council on Foreign Relations, or CFR, an organization the family quietly funded since the 1920s, became one of the most influential think tanks in history. Presidents, generals, diplomats, and CEOs all passed through its doors. The policies that guided America's Cold War strategy, from containment to globalization, often began as quiet discussions inside Rockefeller-funded rooms. David Rockefeller, operating with the precision of a statesman and the reach of a banker, became America's unofficial ambassador to the world. When governments fell, he was there. When currencies collapsed, he was on the phone with presidents. He met kings and dictators alike, from London to Moscow to Tehran, always discussing not just business, but the architecture of the global economy. And yet, not everyone saw it as benevolent. Critics whispered about a shadow government, a quiet network of financiers and policymakers shaping nations from behind closed doors. The Rockefellers, they said, had moved beyond business and into global management. Oil wasn't just an industry anymore, it was leverage. Development aid wasn't just charity, it was influence. And banks weren't just financial institutions, they were tools of alignment in a world divided by ideology. While the Rockefellers expanded outward, the Morgans quietly receded. The old House of Morgan, once the symbol of American finance, had fragmented into modern investment banks, Morgan Stanley and J.P. Morgan & Co., mere shadows of their former unity. Their influence was still vast, but no longer singular. The age of family empires was fading, replaced by corporate systems that followed the blueprint the Rockefellers had perfected. In the 1960s and 70s, as protests erupted across America and the Vietnam War divided nations, David Rockefeller's quiet diplomacy reached its peak. He advocated for free trade, global banking cooperation, and the creation of a connected world, one where capital, goods, and oil could move without borders. To his critics, it sounded like corporate imperialism. To his allies, it was the path to stability. To him, it was simply inevitable. In 1973, he founded the Trilateral Commission, bringing together leaders from North America, Europe, and Japan. Its goal was to coordinate economic policy among the world's most powerful democracies. To the public, it looked like a harmless think tank. To those paying attention, it was the final evolution of the Rockefeller model, a fusion of business, government, and ideology. By the end of the Cold War, one truth had become clear. While nations fought over borders and weapons, the real map of power was drawn by networks of influence, banks, corporations, and foundations. And in almost every corner of that web, somewhere behind the scenes, stood a Rockefeller. The Morgans had ruled the age of steel, railroads, and gold. The Rockefellers ruled the age of oil, finance, and globalization. They had moved beyond America into the bloodstream of the entire world economy. But as the 20th century drew to a close, A new storm was brewing. The world they helped build, interconnected, corporate, and dependent on oil, was about to be disrupted by forces even they couldn't fully control. Technology, digital finance, and new energy revolutions were coming, and for the first time in over a century, the throne of power was empty again.
By the dawn of the 21st century, the names Morgan and Rockefeller had faded from the headlines. The grand mansions had become museums. The family names were etched on university buildings and hospital wings. To most people, they were history, relics of a gilded age. But history, as always, hides its continuity. Because while their names disappeared from the front pages, their systems never left. The world they built didn't vanish, it evolved. The Rockefellers' oil empire became ExxonMobil, Chevron, and Standard of California, corporate giants that still dominate the global energy market. Every gallon of gasoline, every trade in the oil futures market still echoes with their influence. The Morgans banking network, split and reshaped by law, reemerged as J.P. Morgan Chase, now the largest bank in the United States. Ironically, the fusion of both legacies. Two rivals who once fought for control of America's future, reborn as one colossal entity, controlling trillions. It's poetic and a little eerie. Their war ended not with a surrender, but a merger. Today, J.P. Morgan Chase stands as the most powerful financial institution on Earth. And Chase, of course, was once the Rockefellers' bank. It's as if, after a century of warfare, the two dynasties finally fused into the ultimate corporate machine. An empire without a crown. A kingdom hidden in plain sight. Their methods, consolidation, influence, quiet control, became the blueprint for modern capitalism itself. From tech monopolies to global investment firms, every modern titan follows a playbook written 100 years ago in smoky boardrooms lit by oil lamps. And yet, their fingerprints go beyond business. The Rockefeller Foundation still funds global health programs, agricultural research, and environmental initiatives. The Council on Foreign Relations and Trilateral Commission still advise presidents and policymakers. Many of the world's most influential leaders in banking, government, and media trace their mentorships, directly or indirectly, to Rockefeller-funded institutions. Meanwhile, the Federal Reserve System, once designed in response to Morgan's unchecked power, now operates as the world's most influential central bank, steering global markets in ways that would have made even J.P. Morgan pause. His legacy lives on not in his name, but in the machinery of modern finance itself. The question now isn't who controls America, it's whether anyone truly does. The systems the Morgans and Rockefellers created are so vast, so intertwined with governments, corporations, and digital finance, that they operate almost autonomously. No single person could stop them, not even a Rockefeller. And yet, their shadow lingers. Every time oil prices swing, every time the market trembles, every time a quiet meeting at a global forum sets the tone for nations, the echoes of that secret war return. The rivalry that began in boardrooms of the 19th century still shapes the invisible architecture of our world. The irony is almost cinematic. The Morgans wanted control through order, structure, banks, and the power of capital. The Rockefellers wanted control through necessity, oil, energy, and the flow of life itself. In the end, both succeeded. They just did it so completely that their empires became invisible. Because true power doesn't need a name anymore. It doesn't wear crowns, own castles, or make speeches. It writes the rules. It funds both sides. It lives in the systems we use every day. The markets, the currencies, the energy grids, and even the policies we call global cooperation. Their war never really ended. It simply became the world we live in. And as new powers rise, tech billionaires, artificial intelligence, digital currencies, we might be watching the birth of a new dynasty, built on data instead of oil, algorithms instead of steel. But if history teaches us anything, it's this. Every empire begins in ambition and ends when its influence becomes so deep, so invisible, that people forget who built it in the first place. The Morgans and Rockefellers didn't just build fortunes. They built systems of control that outlived them. And if you look closely at every banknote, every barrel, every boardroom, you'll still see the ghosts of that secret war, whispering through the foundations of modern power.